Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach on this, the sixth day of Hanukkah. Tonight we will begin the seventh night together after service as we share a meal. So I want to quickly go through this passage that we just read, the 2 Chronicles 7. And I think you can see why, because it's talking about the temple, the dedication of the temple, and what happened. And then I've got a lot more reading to do. I got some stuff from the Maccabees that I want to read after this. So let's quickly go through this chapter. So we see here, leading up to this, prior to the chapter that we read, Solomon brings the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. The temple has been built. God told David that he wouldn't make it, but his son would make the temple for him. And so now we see the culmination of the place where all through the Torah, we've heard God say, you will celebrate the festivals and you will do these things in the place where I will put my name. And now we get to the point to where he's going to put his name on this place. They build the temple, they bring the Ark of the Covenant in, the glory of the Lord falls, the place is filled with the glory of the Lord. No one can even go into the place because God's glory is so great. And then Solomon says a blessing. He says a blessing over the people, a blessing over the temple. And then he says this incredible prayer, which is again in the prior chapter 6. I'd encourage you to go and read that before Hanukkah's out and just see what he says about God's presence being there in Israel. And now we get to chapter 7. And it says, when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. Again, it says the priest could not enter because the glory was so great. The house, because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. And then it says, all the sons of Israel, seeing the fire come down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshiped the Lord. So everyone sees this. God makes sure that everyone can see what's happening here, that his glory is falling on this place, and this is the place that he's going to choose. We'll jump down to verse 4. The temple isn't just dedicated by Solomon. The temple is dedicated by everyone. It's clear here. The king and all the people offered sacrifice before the Lord. The king offered a sacrifice of 22,000 oxen. 22,000 oxen. You know, when we drove to Texas here recently, we passed by a field of a bunch of cattle out in the field. And I don't think it was 22,000. But that was a lot of cattle, what I saw out there. And so I can imagine 22,000 oxen. That's a lot. And then 120,000 sheep. That's massive. That's a massive amount of animals that are going to be sacrificed. And it says, thus the king and all the people dedicated the house to God. So everyone contributed to this dedication. Everyone gave of their flocks, and they gave this huge sacrifice to the Lord. The priests stood at their posts, and the Levites also with the instruments of the Lord. Okay, so they sang and they made music. They blew the trumpets. It was a celebration. It was a time of worship. And then in verse 7, regarding all of the sacrifices, it says, then Solomon consecrated the middle of the courtyard. He had to consecrate, make holy the middle of the whole courtyard that was before the house of the Lord, for there he offered the burnt offerings and the fat of the peace offerings. He did it in the whole courtyard. Why? Because the bronze altar which Solomon had made was not able to contain the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the fat. So if you remember the dimensions of the bronze altar that they had in the wilderness, I think it was probably about 8 foot by 8 foot, somewhere around there, maybe 7 or 8 foot square, that they had little poles and they would carry it around. That's a pretty big thing to burn. Burn sacrifices on. So it's probably the biggest grill that I can think of. I mean, or if you think about your grill that you might have at home, it's not that big. But that's pretty big, 8 by 8. But all the animals that they had weren't going to fit on there, so they had to burn them there in the courtyard. And I think later, maybe it's in Herod's temple, but I know that they make the altar much bigger, and I think it's like 25 feet by 25 feet. So it's much bigger than what it was initially, because now there's more people bringing sacrifices. So here's what I like to point out at the dedication of the temple, and even at the rededication of Hanukkah as well, and we'll look at that here in a minute. Verse 8, so Solomon observed the feast. It's talking about Sukkot, okay? Because we look at the timing of when this happened, when he dedicated the temple, it's Sukkot. So Solomon observed the feast at that time for 7 days, right? Sukkot was a 7-day festival, and all Israel with him, a very great assembly who came from the entrance of Halamat to the brook of Egypt. On the 8th day, they held a solemn assembly. For the dedication of the altar, they observed for 7 days, and the feast, talking about Sukkot, they observed for 7 days. So when they're dedicating or rededicating the temple, it's not just the temple, it's the altar as well. There's always a focus on the altar. It says, then on the 23rd day of the 7th month, would be the 9th day, after following the 8th day of Sukkot, they sent the people to their tents rejoicing, and they were happy. And now God is going to speak to Solomon about this particular house, about the temple. He appears to Solomon at night, and he says to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. Okay, so he's saying, okay, now I've accepted this building that you've created. I'm going to dwell here. I'm putting my presence here. This is where I'm going to be. And then he says, if I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I send pestilence among my people, and my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. So this tells us why he's going to shut up the heavens and why he's going to do these things to them. It's because they've stopped following him and they're going in a wrong direction. He says, if they turn, if they repent, I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. And verse 15 says, now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayer offered in this place. So he's showing the importance of the temple. Why would his prayers be heard in this place? Because this is where the sacrifices are going to be made, right? This is where God was going to communicate with the people through the sacrifices made by the priests, ultimately through the high priestly sacrifice on Yom Kippur. And we know that all of this points to Yeshua. Okay, all of this is ultimately pointing to Yeshua, who is that ultimate sacrifice. And then he tells Solomon too, if you go the wrong way, then he's not going to be exempt from getting punishment. He's going to be punished as well. In verse 19, but if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I have set up before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot you from my land which I have given you, and this house which I have consecrated for my name will be cast out of my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among all people. So in other words, it's going to be an example. This is what happens if you disobey the Lord. And this place that he said he was going to put his name forever, he will leave. He's going to leave it. He's going to kick them out of his land. As for this house, which was exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to this house? And they will say, because they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them from the land of Egypt, and they adopted other gods and worshiped them and served them. Therefore, he has brought all of this adversity on them. Okay, so it's important. This is the place where God's going to be, but you have to meet him by his standards in the way that he said that you come and you sacrifice. So as I read through this, it just gives me an understanding of what happened during the time of the Maccabees. And so I want to quickly read through the first chapter of Maccabees. And I've told this story to you guys before, but when we first started attending the Messianic congregation, we came out of the Catholic Church, and I had my Catholic Bible with me. And the pastor says, okay, everyone open up to the first book of the Maccabees, chapter 1. And they all started laughing. I didn't know what they meant, because I turned to the Maccabees, because I thought everyone's Bible was the same. I had the Catholic Bibles have the apocryphal books in it, so it has the book of the Maccabees. So I always think about that because when I do this, I pull out my old Catholic Bible. So first book of the Maccabees, chapter 1. I just want to read through this quickly. It starts off with Alexander the Great, and it talks about how he conquered the known world. He divided up his kingdom. He was about to die. He divides up his kingdom into 10 provinces or 10 regions, and gives it to his 10 generals. And then now we're in Maccabees 1, verse 10. The wicked ruler Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus III, was a descendant of one of Alexander's generals. Antiochus Epiphanes had been a hostage in Rome before he became king of Syria in the year 137. Okay, now again, or just to make clear, the book of the Maccabees is not part of the canon, right? It's a historical book. It's not a God-breathed. It's not on par with Scripture, but it has the story of the Maccabees in it, and so that's why I'm going through this. Now, verse 11. This is what's recorded. At that time, there appeared in the land of Israel a group of traitorous Jews who had no regard for the law and who had a bad influence on many of our people. So this is before they're even pressured into doing anything. Okay, obviously there's a lot of Greek influence. Alexander the Great had conquered the place, and I'm sure there's a lot of Greek things going on, but they're not being pressed or pushed to do anything at this point. But there's already a group of people who are saying, let's be like the Greeks. Let's do what they're doing. They said, let's come to terms with the Gentiles, for our refusal to associate with them has brought us nothing but trouble. This proposal appealed to many, and some of them became so enthusiastic about it that they went to the king and received permission from him to follow Greek customs. So they went and asked for permission by the Greek king. Can we do your traditions? And of course, they said yes. They built in Jerusalem a stadium like those in the Greek cities, and they had surgery performed to hide their circumcision. They abandoned the Holy Covenant and started associating with Gentiles and did all sorts of other evil things. And so they had a stadium built in Jerusalem. And in case you didn't know, when they performed the sports and the things that they did like the Greeks, they did it in the nude. That's how the initial Olympics and those sports were done, in the nude. That's the reason why they had to hide their circumcision, because they were going to be seen out in public with everyone else naked. So again, this was before they were even pressed to do anything. They're already getting involved with the Greeks and doing Greek things, going against the law of God, abandoning the law of God. Verse 16. When Antiochus had firmly established himself as king, he decided to conquer Egypt and rule that country as well as Syria. He invaded Egypt with a large fleet of ships and powerful army, including chariots, elephants, and cavalry. When the attack came, King Ptolemy of Egypt turned and fled, and many of his soldiers were killed. Antiochus was able to capture the fortified cities of Egypt and plunder the whole land. Okay, so while he's off in Egypt, he does that over there. And then in the year 143, after the conquest of Egypt, Antiochus marched with a great army against the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. In his arrogance, he entered the temple and took away the gold altar, the lampstand with all its equipment, the table for the bread offered to the Lord, the cups and bowls, the fire pans, the curtain, and the crowns. He also stripped all the gold from the front of the temple and carried off the silver and the gold and everything else of value, including all the treasures that he could find stored there. Then he took it all to his own country. He had also murdered many people and boasted arrogantly about it. There was great mourning everywhere in the land of Egypt. So now Antiochus comes into Jerusalem and he loots the temple. Again, this is the place that they were supposed to communicate with the Lord. And I like to point out here that it says here, one of the first things he takes is the lampstand, the menorah. Okay? I don't know how you guys feel about the miracle of the oil, but I think it's kind of clear that that's just a legend. We don't know that ever happened. It's not recorded anywhere. There was no menorah there for them to light it anyway. Okay, so he comes in and he loots the temple. Verse 26, rulers and leaders groaned in sorrow. Young men and young women grew weak. The beauty of our women faded. Every bridegroom sang a funeral song, and every bride sat mourning in her room. All our people were clothed with shame, and our land trembled for them. 2 years later, okay, 2 years after he did all this, Antiochus sent a large army from Mysia against the towns of Judea. When the soldiers entered Jerusalem, their commander spoke of the people, offering them terms of peace and completely deceiving them. Then he suddenly launched a fierce attack on the city, dealing a major blow and killing many of the people. He plundered the city, set it on fire, and tore down its buildings and walls. He and his army took the women and children as prisoners and seized the cattle. Then Antiochus and his forces built high walls and strong towers in the north area of the temple, turning it into a fort. They brought in a group of traitorous Jews and installed them there. I always think about this. They're Jewish people, but they'd rather be with the Greeks, so much so that they go against their own people. And it reminds me of the various movies that we've seen about the Holocaust and how during the Holocaust the same thing happened. You see Jewish people rising up and being used by the Nazis to control their own people in the concentration camps. It's amazing how, when we get away from the Word of God, how we'll turn on our own people. They brought in a group of traitorous Jews and installed them there. They also brought in arms and supplies and food in the fort, all the loot that they had taken in Jerusalem. This fort became a great threat to the city. So the fort was a threat to the temple, a constant evil menace. Innocent people were murdered around the altar, and the holy place was defiled by murderers. The people of Jerusalem fled in fear, and the city became a colony of foreigners. Jerusalem was foreign to its own people, who had been forced to abandon the city. Her temple was as empty as a wilderness. Her festivals were turned into days of mourning, her Shabbat joy into shame. Her honor became an object of ridicule. Her shame was as great as her former glory, and her pride was turned into deepest mourning. Now, doesn't this describe what God told Solomon would happen if they walked away from him? If they stopped following his ways, how he would turn that place into an example, and how people would see it and say, man, look at this place. What happened? They walked away from God. And we see that they wanted to be like the Greeks, and they were doing all the Greek things. They were walking away from their God. 41 through 43. Antiochus now issued a decree that all nations in his empire should abandon their own customs and become one people. So a little bit is happening at a time. First, the people want to be like the Greeks. Then Antiochus comes in and he loots the place. And now he's forcing them to abandon their customs. All the Gentiles and even many of the Israelites submitted to this decree. They adopted the official pagan religion, offered sacrifices to idols, and no longer observed Shabbat. So they're now being forced to do these things. And it says many of them did it willingly. They did it without a fight. The king also sent messengers with a decree to Jerusalem and all the towns of Judea, ordering the people to follow the customs that were foreign to their country. He ordered them not to offer burnt sacrifices, grain offerings, and other offerings in the temple, and commanded them to treat Shabbat and festivals as ordinary work days. They were even ordered to defile the temple and the holy things in it. They were commanded to build pagan altars, temples, and shrines, and to sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals there. They were forbidden to sacrifice their sons and were required to make themselves fully ritually unclean in every way they could, so that they would forget the law which the Lord had given through Moses and would disobey all its commands. The penalty for disobeying the king's decree was death. Can you imagine that happening today? If we were being forced to go against the Torah? I mean, thankfully we're not experiencing that, but man, I just can't. If you get a chance to read any of Richard Warmbrandt's books, he was the Jew who converted to Christianity, who was enslaved in communist Russia. And they talk about the underground church and the things that they had to do as an underground church in hiding, and how they continued to worship God, but they had codes, and they knew what they could and couldn't say, and behind closed doors they were worshiping God even when they were commanded not to. Are we prepared to do something like that? Do we have the zeal to do that? Would we make the sacrifice to do that? Verse 51, the king not only issued the same decree throughout the whole empire, but he also appointed officials to supervise the people and commanded each town in Judea to offer pagan sacrifices. Many of the Jews were ready to forsake the law and to obey these officials. They defiled the land with their evil, and their conduct forced all true Israelites to hide wherever they could. So now you've got these Jewish people who are willing to do this. But it says the true Israelites were hiding. The true believers in the Lord were hiding. Verse 54. On the 15th day of the month of Kislev in the year 145, King Antiochus set up the awful horror on the temple of Jerusalem. The pagan altars were built in the towns throughout Judea. So what's the awful horror? Some think maybe it was a statue of Antiochus himself. You know, he calls himself Epiphanes because Epiphanes means God manifest. So he's basically saying he is God manifest. And it's like he's saying he's Yeshua. You know, he's God incarnate here on earth. And so he maybe he put up a statue of himself. Some say he put up a statue of Zeus on the altar. But again, what's the altar? The altar is the place where sacrifices are made to the Lord. Pagan sacrifices were offered in front of the houses and in streets. Any books of the Torah which were found were torn up and burned. And anyone who was caught with a copy of the sacred books or who obeyed the Torah was put to death by order of the king. Month after month, these wicked people used their power against the Israelites caught in the towns. On the 25th of the month, these same evil people offered sacrifices on the pagan altar erected on top of the altar in the temple. So on top of the altar, now they put another altar and they're offering pagan sacrifices, probably pigs and things like that. Mothers who allowed their babies to be circumcised were put to death in accordance with the king's decree. Their babies were hung around their necks, and their families and those who had circumcised them were put to death. Many people in Israel firmly resisted the king's decree and refused to eat food that was ritually unclean. They preferred to die rather than break the holy covenant and eat unclean food, and many did. Okay, can you imagine that? Out in the streets, you see a dead mother with a baby tied around her neck. The baby left out in the elements to die. These are examples that they were trying to make for the people to stop following the Torah. And after all of this is listed, after all of this is described, the author of the first book of the Maccabees, he says, in his anger, God made Israel suffer terribly. So, because they understood, if they did wicked, the author of this book, because if they followed after pagan idolatry or they didn't obey God, that God would be the one to do this, to bring them back to himself. In fact, in the second book of the Maccabees, in chapter 6, it says, I beg you not to be discouraged as you read about the terrible things that happened. Consider that this was the Lord's way of punishing his people, not of destroying them. In fact, it is a sign of kindness to punish a person immediately for their sins, rather than to wait a long time. The Lord does not treat us as he does other nations. He waits patiently until they have become deeply involved in sin before he punishes them. But he punishes us before we have sinned too much. So the Lord is always merciful to us, his own people. Although he punishes us with disasters, he never abandons us. I don't think it's the same author of the second book of the Maccabees in the first book, but again, at least they have this understanding of what would happen if they would disobey the Lord. And they had this understanding that it was the Lord who was allowing this to happen, again, to bring them back to themselves. Okay, I'll read a little bit of the second chapter in the first Maccabees. During that time, a priest of Jehorib family named Mattathias, who was the son of John and the grandson of Simeon, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modi'in. Mattathias had 5 sons: John, called Gadi, Simon, called Thassi, Judas, called Maccabeus, Eleazar, called Avron, and Jonathan, called Appas. When Mattathias saw all the sins that were being committed in Judea and Jerusalem, he said, so again, it says, when he saw the sins that were being committed, the sins of the people, and this is the consequence of what's happened because of those sins. He says, why was I born to see these terrible things? The ruin of my people and the holy city. Must I sit here helpless while the city is surrendered to enemies and the temple falls into the hand of foreigners? The temple is like someone without honor. Its splendid furnishings have been carried away as loot. Our children have been killed in the streets and our young men by the sword of the enemy. Every nation in the world has occupied the city and robbed her of her possessions. All her ornaments have been stripped away. She is now a slave, no longer free. Look at our temple, profaned by the Gentiles, emptied of all its splendor. Why should I go on living?" In their grief, Mattathias and his sons tore their clothes, put on sackcloth, and continued in deep mourning. Then the king's officials, who were forcing people to turn from God, came to the town of Modi'in to force the people there to offer pagan sacrifices. Many of the Israelites came out to meet them, including Mattathias and his sons. So you can imagine, they come to the town square, they show up, soldiers show up, and they come up with a pagan altar, they set it up. And the king's official said to Mattathias, "You are a respected leader in this town, and you have the support of your sons and relatives. Why not be the first here to do what the king has commanded? All the Gentiles, the people of Judea, and all the people left in Jerusalem have already done so. If you do, you and your sons will be honored with the title of friends of the king, and you will be rewarded with silver, gold, and many gifts." So they're telling Mattathias, you be the example. You're a priest. Everyone looks up to you. They respect you. So if you do this, then everyone else will follow along. Make it easy on yourself and make it easy on everyone else. But Mattathias answered in a loud voice, "I don't care if every Gentile in this empire has obeyed the king and yielded to the command to abandon the religion of his ancestors. My children, my relatives, and I will continue to keep the covenant that God made with our ancestors. With God's help, we will never abandon this law, the Torah, or obey his commandments, or disobey his commandments. We will not obey the king's decree, and we will not change our way of worship in the least." Just as he finished speaking, one of the Jewish men from Modi'in, decided to obey the king's decree and stepped out in front of everyone to offer a pagan sacrifice on the altar that stood there. When Mattathias saw him, he became angry enough to do what had to be done. Shaking with rage, he ran forward and killed the man right there on the altar. He also killed the royal official who was forcing the people to sacrifice. Then he tore down the altar. In this way, Mattathias showed his deep devotion to the Torah, just as Phinehas had done when he killed Zimri, son of Salu. So Mattathias, he sees this happening. They can't go on. Probably grabs a sword from one of the soldiers there, kills the Jewish guy, kills the official, kills the other guys, tears down the temple. Okay, and they liken him to Phinehas. I would encourage you, I think it's in chapter 2, maybe in chapter 3 of the first book of the Maccabees. When Mattathias dies, he's an older guy, so when he dies, he encourages his son and he mentions all of the people who stood up. It's a really great section. The last thing that he says to encourage his sons before he dies. But so Mattathias stands up, kills the guy. He's compared to Phinehas. Verse 27. Then Mattathias went through the town shouting, "Everyone who is faithful to God's covenant and obeys his Torah, follow me." With this, he and his sons fled to the mountains, leaving behind all they owned. So now they flee. They start this guerrilla warfare, and Mattathias dies, and then the sons keep fighting, and then they finally regain the temple. We're in 1 Maccabees 4. Judas and his brothers said, "Now that our enemies have been defeated, let's go to Jerusalem to purify the temple and rededicate it." Okay, now they've recaptured the temple. Now they're going to go and purify it and rededicate it. So the whole army was assembled, and they went up to Mount Zion. There they found the temple abandoned, the altar profaned, the gates torn down, the courtyards grown up in a forest of weeds, the priests' rooms torn down. In their sorrow, they tore their clothes, cried loudly, threw ashes on their heads, and fell down on the ground. When the signal was given on the trumpets, everyone cried out to the Lord. Then Judas ordered some of the soldiers to attack the men in the fort while he purified the temple. He chose some priests who were qualified and who were devoted to the Torah. They purified the temple and took the stones that had been defiled and put them in an unclean place. They discussed what should be done with the altar of burnt offering, which had been desecrated by the Gentiles, and decided to tear it down so that it would not stand there as a monument to their shame. So they tore down the altar and put the stones in a suitable place on the temple hill where they were to be kept until a prophet should appear and decide what to do with them. So they had to take down the temple, all the stones that are the altar. They took down all those stones. They're not small. These were huge stones that they had to move and put them in a separate place. They took the uncut stones as the law of Moses required and built a new altar like the old one. They repaired the temple inside and out and dedicated its courtyards. They made new utensils for worship and brought the lampstand. See, now they have to bring the lampstand in. They haven't even lit anything. The altar of incense and the table for the bread into the temple. They burned incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the lampstand. Now they light it. But they had plenty of time to make oil. I'm sorry. I get caught up on that because it takes away, the miracle of the oil takes away from the real message of Hanukkah. They burned incense on the altar, lit the lampstands, and there was light in the temple. They placed the loaves of bread on the table, hung curtains, and completed all the work. The 25th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 148, was the anniversary on the day the Gentiles had desecrated the altar. On that day, a sacrifice was offered on the new altar in accordance with the law of Moses. The new altar was dedicated, so now we have the dedication of the altar. Hymns were sung to accompany the harps, lutes, and cymbals. All the people bowed down with their faces to the ground and worshiped and praised the Lord for giving them victory. For 8 days, they celebrated the rededication of the altar. So it says that it was the rededication of the altar that they were celebrating. They purified the temple, and they rededicated the altar. Again, I think it's synonymous because they all go together. With great joy, they brought burnt offerings and offered fellowship offerings and thank offerings. They decorated the front of the temple with gold crowns and shields, rebuilt the gates and the priest's rooms, and put doors on them. Now that the Jews had removed the shame from the Gentiles had brought, they held a great celebration. Then Judas, his brothers, and the entire community of Israel decreed that the rededication of the altar should be celebrated with a festival of joy and gladness at the same time each year, beginning with the 25th month of the month of Kislev, lasting for 8 days. So again, they're celebrating the rededication of the altar. 2 Maccabees 10 says kind of the same thing. 2 Maccabees chapter 10, it says, the happy celebration lasted 8 days like the festival of shelters, or Sukkot. And the people remembered how only a short time before they had spent the festival of shelters wandering like wild animals in mountains and living in caves. But now, carrying green palm branches and sticks decorated with ivy, they paraded around singing grateful praises to him who had brought about the purification of his own temple. Okay, so just like Sukkot, they got branches and stuff that they're waving around and celebrating. Okay, so I know we read a lot. Hopefully you're able to follow all that. But to summarize, with Solomon, God made a place to dwell with Israel. Right? God was already dwelling with them in his own, the Mikdash, the wilderness tabernacle, then the tabernacle that was at Shiloh, and now he has his permanent structure that he's going to dwell with. That was the center of Israel, right? That was the most important place in the world because God's presence was there. Solomon built the place, and God accepted it and said that he would dwell there. However, remember, if they disobeyed God and they didn't follow him, he kicked them out of the land, and he would not dwell in the temple. It says he would cast it out of his sight. And this is what we see during the time of the Maccabees. Okay, we see the punishment that came when the people decided to reject God and to accept this other way of worship, because it wasn't just a lifestyle. It wasn't like we're just going to dress like Greeks. It says they were offering sacrifices to pagan idols. Okay, they were doing exactly what God said not to do. But a few people, a remnant who were devoted to God, were still around. They were the ones who were hiding. They were the ones who still wanted to follow the Lord. And they were the ones who ultimately became the Maccabees. They fought to follow after God. God allowed them to recapture the temple. Just like with Gideon, a small group of people were able to defeat a large enemy. They captured the temple, they purified the temple, and they rededicate it to God. And the temple, again, this is the place where man and God interact. Again, verse 15 in 2 Chronicles 7 says, my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayer offered in this place. So God will hear the prayers that are offered there in the place. The temple, the altar, and all that is in it are a picture of Yeshua, as I've already mentioned, as we all already know. Especially the altar with the sacrifices that were offered to God. they point to the ultimate sacrifice of Yeshua, who allows us to come into communion with the Lord. Also, for us during this season, we see that happen with them. We don't have the temple, but we are a temple of God. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 3:16, do you not know that you are a temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? Okay, so we have the Spirit of God within us, all of us who are believers. We are set apart to be God's people. In Leviticus, in Exodus, in Peter, in 1 Peter, and 1 Thessalonians, we're told to be holy as God says, be holy as I am holy. We're called to be holy. Again, we're set apart to be God's special people. We're not supposed to be like the world or worship God like the world. He's given us his Torah and told us how to live. He's given us special instructions on how to be his people. It's clear on how we're supposed to live. But because we're in the world, we do get tempted to be like the world. Like during the time of the Maccabees, it was much easier for them to give into the world than to live against it. It's easier to go along with everything that's going on around us than to go against the grain. And that's what they did during the time of the Maccabees. They gave in. But it wasn't a good idea because ultimately they're going against God, and you saw the consequences that came upon them. So the same thing can happen to us in that God was going to get our attention. God is going to get our attention if we're veering in our own way and we're abandoning him. And it can happen gradually. Little by little, we allow the world into our lives. We allow things into our lives. The next thing we know, we're not in the Word daily. We're not praying daily. We find reasons not to go to service. We find reasons not to follow the festivals. We find reasons to do other things. We find reasons to do what the world is doing. So we can avoid the hard lessons if we would just obey God. So during this season, we can rededicate ourselves to God. You know, and I talk about this a lot. We get opportunities to rededicate our lives to God every day. When we wake up, we can say, man, I'm going to start off on the right foot. Every week on Shabbat, okay, I'm coming back into the presence of the Lord. It's a moed. I'm going to start back off on the right foot. Every month, you know, if we're following the new moons, we could say, okay, it's a new month. I'm going to start off on the right foot. Every year at every festival, we can find time to say, okay, I'm going to start off on the right foot. And in going through this and thinking about this, rededicating, okay, the temple was dedicated first. Bam, it's dedicated to God. Then it was defiled. It was taken by the pagans. It was made impure, but they purified it, and then they rededicated it. Okay, so when we think about ourselves, we're a believer, boom, we're set apart, we're dedicated to God. And then we allow those impurities into our lives. So rededicating ourselves to God is another way of saying repenting. We've allowed the sin into our lives. We've allowed ourselves to separate ourselves from God. And so now we need to repent, which is turning and going back to the Lord. Okay, rededicating is another way of saying repenting. We're repenting and going back to God. Why? Because we've allowed these things into our lives. We have to purge the impurities from our temple, the impure habits that we've allowed in our lives. What impure things are you doing on a daily basis or as a habit? The impure thoughts that we have in our minds. What are the impure things that we're thinking? We've got to purge that. The impure words that are coming out of our mouth. You know, all these things are flowing from our heart, right? From our mind. We're allowing other things into our lives when we should be focusing on the Word of God and having that first. So this season, again, we have that opportunity. Let's completely purge the impurities from our lives in every area and fully rededicate ourselves to God. It said when the Maccabees recaptured the temple, they went in and they went everywhere and they cleaned out everything. They took out the weeds. They took out all the impure things that were in the temple. We need to do that in our own hearts and in our own minds. In every area of our life, where have we allowed impurities to stay and to grow? So let's live for Him. Let's shine our light, the light of our Messiah that reflects from us in this world of darkness, especially now in this darkest time of the year. Let's be lights. Let's address the impurities in our hearts so that way that light can shine.